Battlefield Medicine, USA is a series produced by Kidney Contenders. Journey through how wounded soldiers were treated across America's major wars. Each era had its own challenges, its own innovations, and its own human stories. Over the next month, I'll be asking Jen Williams, the founder of Kidney Contenders, questions about the realities of combat medicine, from the Civil War all the way to the Persian Gulf War, and she'll walk us through what really happened, how soldiers survived, and how battlefield care evolved. Let's begin at the very start of the timeline. During the Civil War, there were nearly 10,500 military actions recorded across the country. Out of those, historians formally classify about 384 as true battles. Roughly 50 of them were major battles that shaped the direction of the war, while around 100 more had significant impact. The rest were minor battles and skirmishes that still played important roles in the soldiers' daily reality. Jen, let's start with a major battle. The Battle of Gettysburg. Tell us about the context of this battle.
Gettysburg was fought from July 1st until July 3rd in 1863 in southern Pennsylvania. So it marked the turning point of the Civil War. This is actually the moment when the Union forces halted General Robert E. Lee's invasion of the North. Now, the terrain around Gettysburg was rolling farmland and ridges, which became critical high ground during the fighting. Both armies actually converged almost by accident, but once they engaged, the battle grew into one of the largest and bloodiest of the war. One of the terms that you see throughout a lot of the writing during that time is sanguine, which refers to the Latin term for blood. More than 50,000 soldiers were actually killed, wounded, or even missing. So it was a clash of strategy. It was a clash of strategy, endurance, and honestly, it was a clash of sheer human will.
How did the medical teams handle such overwhelming numbers of casualties?
Field hospitals sprang up in barns, churches, and of course, tents. Surgeons worked around the clock, sometimes without any type of anesthesia or proper sanitation. Amputations were common, and infection was definitely rampant. But, even amid the chaos, the Gettysburg battle pushed military medicine forward. Sorry, not further, forward. You had triage systems, ambulance corps, and organized field surgery that actually began to take shape.
Jen, after the battles, what outward physical condition did soldiers from both the Confederate and Union armies show, from the fighting itself and from the medical treatment they received?
Outwardly, I would say that the soldiers of both armies, from everything that I've read, they looked ravaged, not just by battle, but by what their bodies endured afterward. Many were gaunt, their skin gray or sallow from dehydration and kidney strain. And the kidneys, from what we understand, when the kidneys are under constant stress from shock, infection, and lack of clean water, they often began to fail. So they began to fail in those situations. When the kidneys can't filter waste, for example, toxins build up in the blood. And so there were a lot of documented incidences of swelling of the face and hands, darkening of the eyes. And so a lot of the soldiers had almost a waxy, unhealthy tone in appearance. And then there's the reality of hygiene. So the field surgeons worked with bare, unwashed hands. Fecal matter and urine were definitely embedded underneath their fingernails and in the creases of their skin. So every touch carried infection. Soldiers who did survive surgery often developed sepsis, and so their wounds were inflamed, their bodies feverish, their breath sour from systemic infection. You could see it in their posture, their pallor, their trembling. They were alive, yes, in most cases, but visibly they were poisoned by the conditions around them.
Jen, there's something most people never ask about Gettysburg. After days of fighting, dehydration, shock, and contaminated medical care, what was happening inside the soldiers' bodies, especially their kidneys? And how did that internal damage show up in their outward physical appearance?
With all of the documented notation and writing about the conditions these men faced, the part people still overlook appears to be what their bodies actually looked like afterward. Honestly, the outward condition of soldiers from both armies, both the Confederate and the Union, it was rough. And you could see it the moment you looked at them. Days of fighting, almost no sleep, barely any clean water, and the shock of injury all hit their bodies at once. One of the biggest things people forget is what was happening inside their kidneys. Now, obviously, that's not something they were thinking about then, but if we look at it from today's perspective and we look at focusing on the kidneys, I mean, when a soldier is dehydrated, stressed, and losing blood, the kidneys start to shut down. And when the kidneys can't filter waste, all those toxins stay in the body. So, yes, it could definitely be seen on their faces, swelling around the eyes, puffiness in their hands, skin that looked gray or waxy. Some soldiers were confused or shaky because their bodies were basically overloaded with waste they couldn't get rid of. You didn't have dialysis back then, you didn't have any of that. It wasn't just wounds, it was the internal damage showing up on the outside. And then there's the part that nobody talks about that much, and that's hygiene. Field surgeons did not have clean water, soap, or gloves. Their hands were covered in dirt, sweat, and yes, fecal matter and urine, because they were treating hundreds of men in filthy conditions. When that filth gets into a wound, infection spreads fast. Soldiers who survived the initial injury often looked feverish, weak, and swollen because, their bodies were fighting infections from the very hands that were trying to save them. So outwardly, these men looked exhausted, swollen, sick, and worn down. And not just from battle, but from everything their bodies were trying to survive afterward.
Jen, let's pivot to the winter battle at Fort Donelson. Compared to Gettysburg, this was considered a much smaller engagement. In what ways was Fort Donelson viewed as minor?
So Fort Donelson is considered a minor engagement compared to Gettysburg because of its scale, duration, and overall impact. Gettysburg involved more than 160,000 soldiers and lasted 3 days. So it produced the highest casualty count of the entire Civil War. Fort Donelson, by contrast, was a much smaller winter campaign with fewer troops, fewer casualties, and a shorter operational window. Its significance came from the Union's strategic game, opening the Cumberland River and forcing a Confederate surrender. But in terms of size and human loss, it doesn't approach the magnitude of Gettysburg.
Fort Donelson's battle occurred during the winter season. What is documented as occurring to the Confederate and Union soldiers and the Confederate teamsters' bodies as a result of this weather condition?
The winter at Fort Donelson hit the men hard. The soldiers on both sides were exposed for days in freezing rain, sleet, and sudden drops in temperature. The records actually describe bodies going rigid from cold, men collapsing from hypothermia, and extremities turning numb and pale from frostbite. Confederate teamsters, many of them stuck with the wagons overnight, they were found frozen where they sat or lay. So the weather didn't just slow the fighting, it physically shut men down. Their bodies simply, they just simply couldn't keep up with the cold. When we talk about battlefield medicine in the Civil War, the conditions are the part people forget. These soldiers weren't just fighting each other. They were fighting heat. They were fighting cold. They were fighting infection. They were fighting starvation. They were fighting exposure. At Gettysburg, the sheer scale of the wounded overwhelmed every single surgeon. At Fort Donelson, the winter itself shut men down before a doctor ever reached them. Bodies froze, wounds stiffened, and shock set in fast. I think people forget that the medicine of the time wasn't built for any of this. I mean, if you remember anything, remember that the environment during this war was as deadly as the bullets. I mean, the war didn't just break bodies. The conditions finished them.